Hey there, welcome to Nightmare Narratives. I'm here to help you relax tonight. Though, before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It really makes us feel like the global community it is. Just a heads up, there are only a few ads in the first 15 minutes, and after that, it's all completely ad-free. I hope you'll give this video a chance because I truly believe you won't find stories quite like these anywhere else. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin our evening together. What would you do if something followed you home from a spirit board session? If children with completely black eyes knocked on your door at midnight, demanding to be let inside? By the end of this video, you'll understand why some encounters can never be explained away. I'm about to share 5 paranormal encounters that still haunt the people who experience them. These aren't Hollywood fabrications or campfire tales passed down through generations. These are real experiences from real people who wish they could forget what they saw. Some of these stories will make you question what you think you know about reality. And one of them, well, you'll find out why it's the most disturbing later. Let's begin. Story 1. The Brujeria Encounter. Maria Gonzalez never believed in witchcraft. Growing up in a small town outside Guadalajara, Mexico, she'd heard the stories from her grandmother about brujeria, dark magic practiced by those who'd made deals with forces beyond our understanding. But Maria was modern, educated, rational. She'd moved to the United States at 23, built a successful career, and left those superstitions behind. Until the summer of 2019, when she returned home to care for her dying mother. The family home sat on the edge of town, a modest structure with whitewashed walls and a small courtyard. Maria's mother had lived there for 40 years without incident, but within days of Maria's arrival, something changed. It started small, too small to worry about. Maria woke one morning to find strange symbols drawn in the dirt outside the front door, circular patterns with intersecting lines surrounding what looked like crude representations of animals. She assumed neighborhood kids were playing pranks and swept them away. They reappeared the next night, and the night after that. Then the knocking started. 3 sharp raps on the bedroom window at exactly 2:47 a.m. Maria would jolt awake, heart pounding, and see nothing. Just darkness pressing against the glass. But she could feel something out there, watching, waiting. Her mother, weak and bedridden, would whisper warnings. They know you're here. They know you don't believe. That makes you vulnerable. Maria tried to rationalize it. Wind, animals, stress from her mother's condition. But rationality became harder to maintain when objects started moving. A crucifix that had hung in the hallway for decades suddenly fell, landing upside down. Maria rehung it. It fell again, and again. On the 4th attempt, she found the nail still firmly in the wall. The crucifix had somehow lifted itself off and dropped. The kitchen was worse. Plates would slide across counters when no one was looking. Cabinets would swing open in the middle of the night with a slow, deliberate creak. And the refrigerator. Maria swears she saw it shake violently one evening, as if something inside was trying to get out. But nothing prepared her for what she saw at the window. It was the 7th night. Maria sat beside her mother's bed, reading by lamplight, when she felt it. That overwhelming sensation of being watched. She looked up slowly, her eyes drawn to the window. A face stared back at her. Not a human face. The proportions were wrong. Eyes too far apart, mouth too wide, skin the color of ash. It didn't blink, didn't move, just stared with an intensity that made Maria's blood run cold. She screamed. The face vanished. When she finally worked up the courage to check outside, she found fresh symbols in the dirt. But these were different, more complex, more deliberate, and in the center of the largest circle was a photograph of Maria, one that had been in her wallet just hours before. Her mother died 3 days later. Maria left Mexico immediately and hasn't returned since. She had the house blessed by 3 different priests and eventually sold it at a loss. But sometimes, late at night in her apartment in Phoenix, she'll wake at exactly 2:47 a.m. to the sound of 3 sharp knocks. And when she looks at her window, she swears she can see the outline of that face, pressed against the glass from the outside, even though she lives on the 14th floor. Story 2. The Haunted Hospital Wing. Sarah Chen worked the night shift at St. Augustine's Hospital in Portland, Oregon. As a registered nurse with 8 years of experience, she'd seen everything, or so she thought. Death was a regular visitor on the oncology ward where she worked. She'd learned to compartmentalize, to maintain professional distance while still showing compassion. The hospital's East Wing had been built in 1952, and despite renovations, it retained that old institutional feeling. Long corridors with flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic barely masking something older and more organic underneath. Room 237 sat at the end of the hall. It had a reputation among the staff. Patients in that room often reported seeing the visitor, an elderly man in outdated hospital clothing who would sit in the corner chair and watch them throughout the night. Management dismissed it as medication side effects or end-of-life hallucinations. Sarah had always been skeptical. Until October 2021. It was a quiet Tuesday night. Sarah was doing her 2 a.m. rounds when she noticed something odd in the patient log. Room 237 showed a patient admission. John Doe, transferred from ICU, stable condition. But room 237 was empty. Sarah had checked it herself at the start of her shift. She walked down to the room, clipboard in hand, assuming it was a clerical error. The door was closed. She knocked. No response. She opened it. The room was dark, but in the dim light from the hallway, she could see the bed. It was made. Empty. Exactly as it had been hours earlier. Sarah returned to the nurse's station and checked the computer system. The admission was still there, time-stamped at 1:47 a.m., just 13 minutes ago. But there was no patient name now, just a blank field where John Doe had been, and the room number had changed to 237B. There was no room 237B. She asked her colleague, Marcus, if he'd seen anyone transferred to the East Wing. He looked at her strangely. "Sarah, we haven't had an admission all night. It's been dead quiet." Dead quiet. The phrase made her uncomfortable. Against her better judgment, Sarah returned to room 237. This time, she turned on the lights. The room was still empty, but the chair in the corner, the one patients always mentioned, was warm. She touched the seat cushion. Body heat. Recent. Then she heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, shuffling steps. The distinctive sound of hospital slippers on linoleum. Sarah stepped into the corridor and looked both ways. Empty. But the footsteps continued, growing fainter, as if someone was walking away from her down the hall. She followed the sound. The footsteps led her to the old service elevator at the end of the wing. The one that had been decommissioned years ago, its doors permanently locked. But as Sarah approached, she saw the indicator light above the elevator was illuminated. The arrow pointed down. The elevator was descending. She pressed her ear against the metal doors and heard it. Breathing. Labored, wet breathing, like someone with fluid in their lungs. And beneath that, a whisper. She couldn't make out words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. The elevator stopped. The indicator showed B3, the old basement level that had been sealed off in the 1980s after a flood. There was no B3 anymore. The hospital only had 2 basement levels now. Sarah's radio crackled. Marcus's voice. "Sarah, where are you? I need you back at the station. We've got a situation." She ran back, grateful for the excuse to leave. When she reached the nurse's station, Marcus was staring at the computer screen, his face pale. "Sarah, you need to see this." The patient log for room 237 had updated again. It now showed a complete admission record from 1952. Patient name, John Doe. Cause of death, respiratory failure. Time of death, 2:47 a.m. The current time was 2:46 a.m. Sarah transferred to a different hospital 3 weeks later. She never worked another night shift, but she did some research before she left. In 1952, a patient named Jonathan Dockery had been admitted to what was then room 37 in the East Wing. He'd been a homeless man, brought in with severe pneumonia. No family, no identification. The staff called him John Doe. He died alone at 2:47 a.m., sitting in the chair beside his bed, because all the beds were full that night. His body wasn't discovered until the morning shift arrived. When the hospital was renovated in 1975, they renumbered the rooms. Room 37 became room 237, and sometimes Jonathan Dockery still tries to check in. Story 3. Black-eyed children at the door. David Chen had lived in the rental house on Maple Street for exactly 11 months when the knocking started. It was a Tuesday night in late October, the kind of night where autumn had finally committed to becoming winter, cold enough that you could see your breath if you stood outside, but not quite cold enough for frost. The trees lining Maple Street had mostly shed their leaves, and those that remained clung stubbornly to bare branches, rustling in the occasional gust of wind. David had settled into his evening routine with the comfortable predictability of someone who lived alone and liked it that way. At 9:47 p.m., he'd finished the last of his leftover Chinese takeout while watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures. At 10:15, he'd washed his single plate, single fork, and single glass, placing them in the drying rack with the precision of habit. By 10:30, he was in his home office, really just the second bedroom converted with a desk, 2 monitors, and shelves lined with programming books he'd read once and kept as talismans against imposter syndrome. He was 3 hours into debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code for a client project due Friday. The house was quiet except for the ambient sounds David had grown accustomed to. The hum of his computer fans, the occasional creak of settling wood, the distant sound of traffic from the main road 2 blocks over. His neighbors, an elderly couple on one side, a young family on the other, were presumably asleep. The street outside was dark and empty, as it always was after 10 o'clock in this residential neighborhood. David liked the quiet. After growing up in a cramped apartment with 3 siblings, after years of college dorm rooms and shared houses with roommates who never cleaned the bathroom, this rental house represented something precious. Solitude. Space. Peace. He was so absorbed in his code that he almost didn't hear it at first. 3 knocks, deliberate, evenly spaced. Knock, knock, knock. David's fingers paused over his keyboard. He glanced at the clock in the corner of his monitor. 11:30 p.m. Who would be knocking at 11:30 on a Tuesday night? He waited, listening. Maybe he'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the house settling, or a branch hitting the siding in the wind. Knock, knock, knock. No, that was definitely someone at the front door. David pushed back from his desk and walked through the house to the front door. He moved through the darkened living room, guided by the glow of the porch light seeping through the window beside the door. Through the peephole, he could see two small figures standing on his porch. Children. David's first thought was confusion. What were kids doing out this late? His second thought was concern. Were they lost? Hurt? He unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door, leaving the security chain engaged. The gap was wide enough to see them clearly, but narrow enough to maintain a barrier. "Hello?" David said. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" The children stood perfectly still on his porch, a boy and a girl, both appearing to be around 10 or 11 years old. The boy wore a dark hoodie and jeans. The girl wore a simple dress that seemed too thin for the cold October night. Neither wore a jacket. "We need to use your phone," the boy said. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script. "Our parents are supposed to pick us up," the girl added in the same monotone. "But they're not here. We need to call them." David felt a prickle of unease, though he couldn't immediately identify why. Something about the situation felt off. "Where are your parents supposed to pick you up?" he asked. "This is a residential street. There's nothing here but houses." "We got lost," the boy said. "We need to use your phone." "Can we come inside?" the girl asked. "It's cold out here." David noticed she wasn't shivering, despite wearing only a thin dress. Neither child showed any signs of being cold. No visible breath clouds, no hugging themselves for warmth, no shifting from foot to foot. "Why don't you tell me your parents' number?" David said, pulling his phone from his pocket. "I'll call them for you from here." "We need to come inside," the boy insisted. "Please let us in." "We can't use the phone unless we come inside," the girl said. That made no sense. David could call from right here. He could relay messages. There was no reason they needed to come inside. "Look," David said, his unease growing. "Just give me the number and I'll—" The boy looked up, and David saw his eyes. They were completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye, from corner to corner, was solid black, like someone had filled the eye sockets with ink. David's breath caught in his throat. He took an involuntary step backward. The girl looked up too, and David saw that her eyes were the same. Two pools of absolute darkness where eyes should be. No whites, no irises, no pupils, just black. "Please let us in," they said together, their voices overlapping in an unsettling harmony. Every instinct David possessed screamed at him to slam the door, but he found himself frozen, staring at those impossible eyes. What's wrong with your eyes?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing's wrong," the boy said. "We just need to come inside." "Please," the girl added. "We're so cold. We just want to get warm." But they still weren't shivering, still showed no signs of cold. And those eyes, those terrible, empty black eyes, never blinked. David's rational mind tried to find an explanation. Contact lenses? Some kind of medical condition? But he'd never heard of anything that could make someone's entire eye turn black like that. And the way they stood, perfectly still, not fidgeting the way children normally did. "I think you should go home," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can't let you inside." "We can't go home," the boy said. "Not until we come inside first." "That's the rule," the girl said. "We have to be invited in." The phrasing struck David as odd. Invited in. Like they were vampires or something from a fairy tale. The thought was absurd, but it lodged in his mind anyway. "I'm going to close the door now," David said, reaching for the handle. "Please don't," the boy said. and for the first time, there was something like emotion in his voice. Not pleading exactly, but something harder, something that sounded almost like a threat. "You should let us in. It would be better if you let us in." "We just want to use your phone," the girl said. "Why won't you help us? Don't you help children?" The guilt trip was obvious, manipulative, but it still worked on some level. David felt a twinge of shame. These were children. What if they really were in trouble? What if there was some rational explanation for their appearance? But then the boy smiled, and David's blood ran cold. It wasn't a child's smile. It was too wide, too knowing, too empty of genuine warmth. It was the smile of something wearing a child's face like a mask. "Let us in," the boy said, still smiling that terrible smile. "Let us in, David." David's heart stuttered. He hadn't told them his name. David stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the door. He tried to slam it shut, but it wouldn't close. As if something was blocking it, though the children hadn't moved from their positions on the porch. "Please let us in," they said together now, their voices overlapping in that unsettling harmony. "We can't come in unless you invite us. Please, let us in." The temperature dropped precipitously. David could suddenly see his breath forming thick clouds in the air. The warmth of his house seemed to be sucked out through the open door, replaced by a cold that felt wrong. Not like winter cold, but like the cold of deep places, of graves, of spaces where warmth had never existed. Goosebumps erupted across David's arms. His teeth began to chatter. The cold was so intense it hurt, like tiny needles pricking his skin. The porch light began to flicker. On, off, casting the children's faces in alternating light and shadow. But those eyes remained constant. Two pools of absolute darkness in each small face, somehow visible even when the light went out. "We're so cold," the girl said, though her breath didn't fog the air like David's did. "We just want to get warm. You wouldn't leave children out in the cold, would you?" "What are you?" David managed to ask through chattering teeth. "We're children," the boy said. "We're just children who need help. Why won't you help us, David?" There it was again. His name. How did they know his name? "We know lots of things," the girl said, as if reading his thoughts. "We know you live alone. We know you stay up late working. We know you're a good person who helps people. That's why we came to your door." "We've been watching," the boy added, "waiting for the right time." The flickering light was making David dizzy, or maybe it was the cold, or maybe it was the sheer wrongness of the situation. These things that looked like children but moved like puppets, spoke like recordings, stared with eyes that held no light. "Please," the girl said, and now her voice did take on an emotional quality, but it was the wrong emotion, something hungry and eager disguised as desperation. "Please let us in. We promise we'll be good. We promise we won't hurt you. We just need to come inside, just for a moment, just to get warm." Every fiber of David's being screamed that this was a lie, that whatever these things were, they would not be good, that letting them inside would be the worst mistake of his life, possibly the last mistake of his life. He threw his full weight against the door. For a moment, it still wouldn't budge, that invisible resistance pushing back. But David pushed harder, driven by pure primal fear, and suddenly the resistance gave way. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the frame. David immediately engaged the deadbolt, then the security chain, then pressed his back against the door, breathing hard. The knocking started immediately. Knock, knock, knock. 3 deliberate raps, just like before. Knock, knock, knock. David slid down to the floor, his back still against the door, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Knock, knock, knock. "Let us in, David," came the boy's voice, muffled by the door but still clear. "You can't keep us out forever." "We'll wait," the girl's voice added. "We're very patient. We've waited before." Knock, knock, knock. David's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? There are children at my door," David said, his voice trembling. "They won't leave. There's something wrong with them. Their eyes are... I don't know how to explain it. Please, send someone." "Are the children threatening you, sir?" "Yes. No, I don't know. They're asking to come inside and they won't leave. And there's something very wrong. Please, just send someone." "Officers are on their way. Stay inside and don't open the door. Can you still hear the children?" David listened. The knocking had stopped. The house was silent. "No," he said. "It's quiet now." "The officers will be there in approximately 5 minutes. Stay on the line with me." Those 5 minutes felt like hours. David remained on the floor, back pressed against the door, phone clutched in his hand, listening to the dispatcher's calm voice while his mind raced. What were those things? Why had they come to his door? How did they know his name? And why did they need to be invited inside? When the police finally arrived, 2 officers in a squad car, lights flashing, David met them at the door. He was still shaking, still felt the lingering cold in his bones, despite the house's heating system running full blast. "I'm Officer Martinez," said the older of the 2, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes. "This is Officer Park. You called about children at your door?" "Yes," David said, stepping aside to let them in. 2 kids, a boy and a girl. They were knocking, asking to come inside, and their eyes were completely black. All black. No whites, no color, just black. The officers exchanged a glance that David couldn't quite read. "Let's take a look outside," Officer Park said, a younger man who couldn't have been more than 25. They checked the porch first. Nothing. No children. No signs that anyone had been there at all. "Was it raining earlier?" Officer Martinez asked, shining her flashlight across the porch boards. "Yes," David said. "It stopped around 9 o'clock. "The porch is dry," she noted. "If children had been standing here for any length of time, there should be wet footprints or at least some disturbance in the dust." But the porch was pristine, undisturbed. They checked the yard, the sidewalk, the street. Officer Park walked the perimeter of the house while Officer Martinez stayed with David. "Has anything like this happened before?" she asked gently. "No, never. I've lived here 11 months, and nothing like this has ever happened." "Any history of sleepwalking, sleep paralysis? Sometimes these experiences can feel very real." "I wasn't asleep," David interrupted. "I was working, at my computer. I was wide awake." Officer Park returned, shaking his head. "No signs of anyone, no footprints, no disturbances. I checked all the windows and doors, everything's secure." "Mr. Chen," Officer Martinez said carefully, "is it possible you might have dozed off at your computer? Sometimes when we're working late, we can experience what's called a hypnagogic hallucination." "I know what I saw," David insisted. "They were real. They were standing right there." He pointed to the spot on the porch where the children had stood. "I believe you saw something," Officer Martinez said diplomatically. "But there's no evidence anyone was actually here. No footprints despite the recent rain. No signs of disturbance. And the description you gave, children with completely black eyes, that's not something that occurs naturally. Wait, David said suddenly. My doorbell camera. It records everything. I can show you. David led them to his laptop, pulling up the doorbell camera app. His hands were still shaking as he navigated to the recordings from tonight. Here, he said, clicking on the timestamp, 11:30 p.m. The three of them crowded around the screen, watching. The video showed David's front porch, illuminated by the porch light. At 11:32 p.m., the door opened. David appeared in the frame, looking out at nothing. The porch was empty. No, David whispered. No, that's not right. They were there. Right there. But the video showed him speaking to empty air. It showed him stepping back, his face registering fear and confusion. It showed him trying to close the door, struggling with it for a moment, then finally slamming it shut. Against nothing. There were no children in the video, no figures on the porch. Just David, alone, talking to darkness. I don't understand, David said, his voice breaking. They were there. I saw them. I talked to them. They knew my name. Officer Martinez put a gentle hand on his shoulder. Mr. Chen, I think you should consider seeing a doctor. What you experienced sounds like it could have been a very vivid hallucination. Stress, lack of sleep, working long hours. These things can affect our perception. I'm not crazy, David said, but even to his own ears, his voice lacked conviction. The officers stayed for another 20 minutes, checking the house, making sure David felt safe. They were professional, kind even, but David could see the skepticism in their eyes. They thought he was having some kind of breakdown. After they left, David sat alone in his living room, the laptop still open to the doorbell footage. He watched it again, and again. Each time the same thing. David opening the door to nothing. David talking to empty air. David struggling to close a door that had no visible obstruction. But David knew what he'd seen. He knew what he'd experienced. He was about to close the laptop when something made him pause. A thought, or maybe just a desperate need to prove to himself that he wasn't losing his mind. He opened the video and editing software and began scrubbing through it frame by frame. Slowly, methodically. 11:32:15. Door opens. Empty porch. 11:32:47. David speaking. Empty porch. 11:33:12. David stepping back. Empty porch. 11:33:33. David struggling with the door. David's breath caught. At exactly 11:33:33, there was something. Just for a single frame, 1/24th of a second. The darkness on the porch seemed to have shape. Two small shapes, standing perfectly still where the children had been. David's hands trembled as he zoomed in on that single frame. The image was grainy, pixelated from the enlargement, but he could see it. Two silhouettes, darker than the surrounding darkness, as if they were absorbing light rather than reflecting it. And there, where eyes should be, were 4 pinpoints of light. Not reflected light from the porch lamp, light coming from within the darkness itself. 4 points of luminescence in the shapes of eyes, the wrong kind of eyes. David sat back, his heart pounding. He took a screenshot of the frame, then another, zooming in as far as the resolution would allow. The shapes were definitely there, and those points of light, they were positioned exactly where the children's eyes had been. But instead of the black voids David had seen, the camera had captured something else. Some kind of light, or energy, or something. He checked the timestamp again. 11:33:33. 3 threes. 3 and 3 and 3. Knock, knock, knock. David jumped, nearly falling out of his chair. His eyes shot to the clock on his laptop. 11:30 p.m. Exactly 24 hours since the first knock. Knock, knock, knock. No, David whispered. No, no, no. He didn't go to the door. He didn't even move from his chair. He sat frozen, listening. Knock, knock, knock. Then, muffled by the door but still clear, "David, we know you're there. We can wait. We're very patient." David didn't sleep that night. He sat in his living room with every light in the house turned on, a baseball bat across his lap, listening to the periodic knocking that continued until exactly 11:45 p.m., then stopped. When dawn finally came, he called in sick to work. He spent the day researching black-eyed children, black-eyed kids, BEKs. The internet was full of stories, hundreds of them, thousands. People from all over the world reporting encounters with children who had completely black eyes, who asked to be let inside, who knew things they shouldn't know. Most of the stories followed the same pattern. The children appeared at night, usually in pairs, always asking to come inside or to be let into a car. They claimed to need help, to need a phone, to need a ride. They were always insistent, and they always needed to be invited in. Those who let them in, well, those stories were fewer and darker. David read account after account of people who'd made that mistake. Some reported feeling drained, exhausted, ill for weeks afterward. Some reported objects in their homes moving, electronics malfunctioning, a persistent sense of being watched. Some reported worse things. And some never reported anything at all because they were never heard from again. The rational part of David's mind insisted this was all internet folklore, urban legends, mass hysteria. But the rational part of his mind was getting quieter, drowned out by the memory of those black eyes, that wrong smile, that voice saying his name. That night, at 11:30 p.m., the knocking came again. David didn't answer. He didn't even go near the door. He sat in his bedroom with the door locked, headphones on, music playing loud enough to drown out any sound from outside. But at 11:33, the music cut out. His phone's battery had died, even though it had been at 87% a moment before. In the silence, he heard it. Knock, knock, knock. And then, "David, we'll be back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. We're very patient. Eventually, you'll let us in. Everyone does. Eventually." David moved out 2 weeks later. He didn't tell his landlord why, just that he needed to break the lease early and was willing to forfeit his security deposit. He packed his essentials, left everything else, and moved into a hotel across town. The knocking had continued every night, always at 11:30 p.m., always 3 sets of 3 knocks, always followed by those voices, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening, always patient. David had stopped answering his door entirely, even during the day. He had his groceries delivered and left on the porch. He worked from home but could barely concentrate. He'd lost weight, developed dark circles under his eyes, jumped at every sound. He couldn't stay there anymore. The house on Maple Street sat empty for 3 months before the landlord found a new tenant. A young couple, newly married, excited about their first place together. They lasted 3 weeks. The wife called the landlord in tears, saying they were breaking the lease. She wouldn't explain why over the phone, but when pressed, she finally said, "There are children who knock on our door at night. They ask to come inside. My husband almost let them in last night. I had to physically pull him away from the door. We're not staying here another night." The next tenants were a single mother with a teenage daughter. They made it a month before leaving in the middle of the night, abandoning most of their belongings. The third attempt was a retired couple. They lasted 2 weeks. After that, the landlord stopped trying to rent the house. It sits empty now, the lawn overgrown, the porch light burned out. There's a for sale sign in the yard, but it's been there for 8 months with no offers. The neighbors don't talk about it much, but if you ask them, really press them, some will admit to hearing things at night, knocking, children's voices, always around 11:30 p.m. And if you check the neighborhood watch forums, you'll find posts from residents on Maple Street reporting strange occurrences, doorbell cameras malfunctioning, pets refusing to go near certain houses, children in the neighborhood reporting new friends who only come out at night and have funny eyes. David never went back to Maple Street. He moved to a different city entirely, found a new apartment in a high-rise building with 24-hour security and cameras everywhere. But sometimes, late at night, when he's working at his computer and the building is quiet, he hears it. 3 knocks. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Knock, knock, knock. And he wonders, did they follow him? Or were they already here, waiting? Because that's the thing about the black-eyed children. They're not bound to one location. They're not limited to one house, one street, one town. They're everywhere. And they're patient. They'll wait as long as it takes. Years, decades, lifetimes. Because eventually, everyone opens the door. Eventually, everyone lets them in. If you ever encounter children at your door late at night, children who ask to come inside, children whose eyes are wrong, children who know things they shouldn't, remember David's story. Don't open the door. Don't engage with them. Don't let them in. Because some invitations, once extended, can never be taken back. And some guests never leave. Story 4. The Ouija board that wouldn't stop. Jessica Martinez was 19 when she made the worst mistake of her life. It was Halloween weekend, 2018, and she and 3 friends decided to have a seance party at her apartment in Austin, Texas. They'd bought a Ouija board from a vintage shop downtown, an old wooden one, worn smooth from decades of use. They thought it would be fun, a silly game to play while drinking cheap wine and watching scary movies. Jessica had heard the warnings. Never use a Ouija board alone. Always say goodbye. Never let the planchette count down or go through the alphabet. But those were just superstitions, right? Urban legends to make the game more exciting. They lit candles, turned off the lights, and placed their fingers on the planchette. "Is anyone there?" Jessica asked, trying not to laugh. The planchette didn't move. They asked again. Nothing. "This is stupid," her friend Marcus said, starting to pull his hand away. That's when the planchette jerked violently to yes. At first, they were excited. They asked questions. "What's your name?" The board spelled out Z-O-Z-O. "How did you die?" The planchette moved in figure eights, faster and faster, until they could barely keep their fingers on it. Then the questions got darker. Without anyone asking, the board started spelling Y-O-U-W-I-L-L-D-I-E. "Okay, that's not funny," Jessica said, looking at her friends. "Who's pushing it?" They all denied it, but the planchette kept moving. S-O-O-N. 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 Marcus tried to lift his hands. "Let's stop." But the planchette wouldn't let him. His fingers seemed glued to it, pulled by an invisible force. The candles flared, their flames stretching toward the ceiling. The temperature plummeted. "Say goodbye!" Jessica screamed. "We have to say goodbye!" They tried to move the planchette to goodbye. It fought them, dragging toward the numbers instead. It started counting down. 9, 8, 7. When it reached 1, every candle in the room extinguished simultaneously. In the darkness, they heard breathing, not their own, something else. Something that sounded wet and labored, like lungs filled with fluid. The lights came back on. The Ouija board was smoking. A thin line of char burned across its surface, connecting every letter they'd used. They threw it away immediately, breaking it into pieces first, just like the legend said to do. But that wasn't the end. That night, Jessica woke to scratching sounds. 3 long scratches appeared on her bedroom wall while she watched, carved by invisible claws. In the morning, she found the same 3 scratches on her bathroom mirror, then on her car door, then on her desk at work. Always 3 scratches, always appearing when she wasn't looking directly at the surface. Her friends experienced it too. Marcus found his apartment door covered in scratches. Another friend, Sarah, woke with 3 long scratches down her back, deep enough to draw blood. They tried everything: priests, psychics, cleansing rituals. Nothing worked. Then Jessica remembered. They'd never said goodbye. The session had never properly ended. According to Ouija board lore, that meant the portal they'd opened was still open, and something had come through. She bought another board. Against every instinct, against everyone's advice, she set it up alone in her apartment. She placed her fingers on the planchette. "Zozo," she said. "I'm here. We need to finish what we started." The planchette moved immediately to yes. "We're going to say goodbye now. You have to let us go." The planchette circled the board violently, knocking over candles, spinning so fast it flew off the board entirely. Jessica heard that breathing again, right behind her ear. She felt cold fingers touching the back of her neck, but she grabbed the planchette, forced it back to the board, and with every ounce of strength she had, dragged it to goodbye. The apartment shook. Picture frames fell. Glass shattered. Jessica held the planchette on goodbye until her fingers ached. Then, silence. The scratches stopped appearing that night. Jessica and her friends never experienced another incident, but Jessica kept that second Ouija board. She locked it in a box and buried it in her parents' backyard, 6 feet deep, wrapped in salt and sealed with wax. Because 3 months after she said goodbye, she had a dream. In the dream, she was back in her apartment on that Halloween night. But this time, when she looked at the Ouija board, she could see what they'd really been talking to. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a demon. It was something older. Something that existed in the spaces between yes and no, between hello and goodbye. Something that fed on fear and grew stronger with every question asked, every portal opened by curious people who thought it was just a game. And in the dream, it thanked her. Because even though she'd closed her portal, somewhere else in the world, someone else was opening theirs. The game never really ends. Story 5. The Appalachian Mimic. Thomas Brennan was an experienced hiker. At 42, he'd conquered trails across the United States, from the Pacific Crest to the Continental Divide. The Appalachian Trail was his favorite. He'd hiked sections of it every year for the past decade. In October 2022, he decided to do a solo 3-day trek through a remote section in North Carolina. He'd done this particular route before. He knew the terrain, had proper supplies, and had informed the ranger station of his plans. The first day was perfect. Clear skies, beautiful fall foliage, the peaceful solitude he craved. He made camp at a designated site, ate dinner, and settled into his tent as darkness fell. Around 2 a.m., he woke to the sound of his own voice calling from the woods. "Tom? Tom, are you there?" It was his voice, his exact voice. Same pitch, same cadence, same slight Texas accent. But he was alone. and he was Tom. Thomas lay frozen in his sleeping bag, his heart pounding. The voice called again, closer this time. "Tom, I need help. I'm lost. Can you hear me?" Every instinct told him not to respond. In Appalachian folklore, there are stories about things in the woods that mimic human voices, creatures that use familiar sounds to lure people away from safety. Thomas had always dismissed them as campfire tales, but now, hearing his own voice calling to him from the darkness, those stories felt terrifyingly real. He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped his tent just enough to peer out. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and undergrowth. Nothing else. "Tom, please. I can see your light. I'm hurt." The voice was maybe 50 yards away, coming from deeper in the forest, away from the trail. Thomas knew better than to leave the campsite at night. He knew the dangers: uneven terrain, cliffs, getting disoriented in the dark. But what if it really was someone who needed help? What if another hiker was injured and calling out? He stepped out of his tent. "Where are you?" he called back, immediately regretting it. "Follow my voice," it responded. "I'm not far. Please hurry." Thomas moved toward the voice, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth. The forest seemed different at night. The familiar trail markers were harder to spot. The trees pressed in closer, the darkness between them absolute. "Keep talking so I can find you," Thomas said. "I'm here. Right here. Can't you see me?" But Thomas saw nothing. Just trees and shadows and the weak circle of his flashlight. That's when he noticed something wrong. The voice was moving, not staying in one place like an injured person would. It was circling him, getting closer with each call, but always staying just beyond his light. "Tom, why won't you help me? I'm right here." Now the voice was behind him. Thomas spun around, his flashlight catching nothing but empty forest. His camp was no longer visible. He'd walked farther than he'd realized, turned around more than he'd thought. He was lost. "Tom, Tom, 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 Tom." The voice began repeating his name faster and faster, the words overlapping until they became a horrible chant. And it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was dozens, all using his voice, coming from every direction. Thomas ran. He didn't know which way, didn't care. He just ran, branches whipping his face, roots grabbing at his feet. Behind him, the voices followed, always just behind him, calling his name in that awful chorus. He burst into a clearing and stopped, gasping. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. It looked like him. Same height, same build, same hiking clothes. But it was wrong. The proportions were slightly off, the movements too fluid, too boneless. And when it turned to face him, Thomas saw that it had his face, but the features were like a mask that didn't quite fit, stretched and distorted. "Found you," it said with his voice. The thing smiled, and its mouth opened far too wide, revealing rows of teeth that belonged to no human being. Thomas did the only thing he could think of. He closed his eyes and stood perfectly still. He remembered something his grandfather had told him about Appalachian creatures, some of them hunted by movement, by fear, by the energy of panic. So he stood still. He controlled his breathing. He thought of calm things, peaceful things, anything to slow his racing heart. The forest went silent. No wind, no insects, no voices. When Thomas finally opened his eyes, he was standing at the edge of his campsite. His tent was 20 feet away, exactly where he'd left it. His flashlight was in his hand, though he didn't remember picking it up. The sky was beginning to lighten with dawn. Thomas packed up his camp as soon as there was enough light to see. He hiked straight back to the trailhead, a 6-hour journey he completed in 4. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. When he reported the incident to the ranger station, the ranger's face went pale. "You're the 3rd person this month," she said quietly. "Same area, same story. Something calling out in their own voice." She pulled out a map and marked the location where Thomas had camped. There were 2 other marks nearby. The Cherokee called this area the place where the voice steals. They wouldn't hunt here, wouldn't gather here. They said something lived in these woods that wore human shapes like clothes, that learned human voices like songs. "What is it?" Thomas asked. The ranger shook her head. "I don't know, but I know this. Every person who's encountered it and lived had one thing in common. They didn't follow the voice, or if they did, they found a way to stop believing in what they were seeing." Thomas never hiked alone again, and he never returned to that section of the Appalachian Trail. But sometimes, late at night, he still hears it, his own voice, calling to him from the darkness outside his window, asking him to come outside, telling him it's safe now. He never answers, and he never opens the door, because he knows that thing is still out there, wearing his voice like a stolen coat, still calling, still waiting, still hungry for whatever it is that makes us human, and it will wait forever. 5 stories, 5 encounters with things that shouldn't exist, things that hide in the spaces between belief and disbelief, between the known and the unknown. The question isn't whether these stories are true. The question is, what are you going to do the next time you hear something calling your name from the darkness? The next time you see something that doesn't quite look right? The next time your instincts scream at you to run? Will you listen? This is Nightmare Narratives, where the darkness is always listening, and some stories never truly end. Sleep well, if you can. If these stories disturbed you, if they made you check your locks or glance over your shoulder, then you need to subscribe to Nightmare Narratives. Every week, I bring you new, true horror stories from the darkest corners of reality. Real encounters, real terror, real warnings. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you never know when the next story might save your life, or at least prepare you for what's coming. Drop a comment and tell me, which story disturbed you the most? Was it the black-eyed children, the Appalachian mimic, or something else entirely? And if you've had your own paranormal encounter, if you've seen something you can't explain, share it in the comments. Your story might be featured in a future episode. Until next time, keep your doors locked, your lights on, and remember, some things are better left uninvited. This is Nightmare Narratives, where darkness lingers and stories haunt long after they're told.